Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a Soka researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, Scott. It's great to be here. My name is Ian Reed. I am a professor of Latin American Studies at Soka University. I also serve as the Associate Dean of Faculty, and I have a couple other roles in Soka Institute for Global Solutions and in the Race, Ethnicity, and Human Rights Center. So it's an exciting job, and it's just great to be here.
So great to have you on the podcast, Ian. Thank you. This is a very important historic moment for me because, I graduated from Soka University and you were like my favorite professor, and I took a lot of classes with you, and there were a lot of journeys as well abroad that I felt were so formative to who I am today. Brazil was a big part of that as well. Going to Brazil, studying about Brazil, and also just really important to my own formation as a global citizen. So this has been a long time coming. I've wanted you on the podcast for a long time, but I felt no, I need to train myself a little bit more. Got to get better at this podcasting thing, and now I think that time has come where we're gonna share the space. I feel like it's gonna be really exciting to learn more about kind of what were the major events and experiences and influential people that shaped you. It's all interconnected, I feel like, in terms of what you've been through, what your aspirations are, how that brought you to a place like Soka University. I'm just very happy to share this space with you. So I'm sure, more of the kind of connecting points, even within our two journeys, will kind of, connect and converge. But, I'd love to hear, even from earlier days, right, of kind of I don't know, even from your childhood. That would be really awesome to kind of hear about what got you interested in maybe the, Latin America, just broadly as a region. What got you interested in taking more of kind of researcher lens, and then what's new, kind of what's happening in the world. There's so much. But what are you really focusing your attention on, and how does that connect to global citizenship? So from whatever point you'd like to start, Ian, I just wanted to give you this time to really speak about what led you to the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, Scott, that's a big question, and let me take it on. But before that, I just again give my gratitude for being here. I know I've been following your pursuit of the podcast, I think, since you began, right? I don't remember how long ago. How long ago was that, Scott? What year did you start?
I started in 2020, so in
2020.
November it'll mark 5 years of
Five
this
years,
pursuit.
yeah. I
I
was
know.
guessing 3, 4, but 5, it makes sense. Wow. Yeah, so I've always been interested, and I've not been able to listen to every podcast, but I've listened to quite a few, and I've especially when you interview folks we both know, and there are some. And in fact, just recently you interviewed Kamiko, who I've had great pleasure of working with, and I can't wait to reconnect with. I haven't spoken with her in a while, but doing amazing work. And so there are these overlaps, with your podcast. So it's just, yeah, it's so much fun to be here. And after you've done, this is going to be number 100 and something, right, Scott? I don't remember
Is
how
it
many.
182?
182.
Yeah.
Wow, that is amazing. So, Scott, just so impressed and happy to be here. So thank you for allowing this. So yeah, big story. How did I get here, and what am I doing now, or what's interesting? Um, you know, so my path has led me to academia, but I think a special kind of academia in a liberal arts setting. And I also think that while a lot of what I do is I do a lot of research. I've increasingly turned more towards the 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 application, right? And that's always been there in terms of classroom teaching, and then especially in some of the field study or study abroad courses I've done, which was our first, or one of our first collaborations, right, through the study abroad to Brazil. So how did I get to this place of academia in which, and this kind of application of these ideas and working with education and more recently with technology and artificial intelligence? Um, what are the origin stories? That's such a hard question for any person to identify. Of course, I go back to my parents, my family. Um, I lived mostly in the Midwest, and when I was growing up through high school, my my father was a computer programmer, so that I think gives some influence of why my current interest in programming and artificial intelligence. But my mom was pursuing her PhD. She was pursuing a PhD in theology, or the history of religion, at the University of Chicago. And this is through elementary school and middle school, and she started teaching at DePaul University when I was in high school. So we didn't have a lot of money because there were three kids. My dad was making salary, which was great, of course, but at the same time paying for my mother's graduate school, and she wasn't making income. So we lived in I would say lower income bracket community. It was very, uh, for the about 8 years or so, I lived in a community that was racially diverse. It was a kind of townhome community. It was a bedroom community of both blue and white collar workers, who commuted generally to Chicago and the suburbs. And the schools were not great. I struggled a little bit with the schools. And I didn't get good grades, in part because I just don't think I had very inspiring classes. But what I recognize now was, and we talk a lot about privilege these days, is the privilege of having two highly educated uh, parents. My father had gotten a master's degree in mathematics, and he had worked for many years in programming. My mother was a trained artist, professional artist, and then she went back, got her master's degree at University of Colorado, and then went to University of Chicago for a PhD. And as I was growing up, she was sharing some of this journey with me as a child, learning about different religions, and her focus was Mesoamerica, or the Aztecs. So when I got to my first freshman sophomore year, I actually traveled with her on some of her field studies. So while we were economically class based in a position in which I was interacting with peers from very diverse backgrounds and races, uh, I had this different experience that is generally only open to people with quite a bit of money and privilege, really, to travel, to be exposed to high levels of education. But as a kid, I didn't recognize these influences. But it set me on a path. I would also say, Scott, that the other big influencer for me was that I'm actually a fifth generation Unitarian Universalist. And I point out the fifth generation because that is really, really rare. You can find fifth generation Catholics, and Protestants, but among Unitarian Universalists, I think something like 75% of UUs um, became UUs in their adulthood. So I was raised it. My mom was raised it. My grandparents were raised it. And Unitarian Universalism is a very open theology. It draws from different faiths. It asks its members to come up with their own spiritual religious path using wonderful religious sources, such as Christianity, Judaism, Islam, indigenous beliefs. It sees science and secularism and humanism as sources of truth, and Buddhism. And in fact, Buddhism was a big part and is often a big influence in Unitarian Universalists. And philosophically, I lean towards Buddhism, um, but I think religiously, it's also very much grounded in humanism. But it gave me a great appreciation for the enormous diversity of religious beliefs and how we can celebrate th- their their views and grow from them. And so this was I think, a very early lesson in global citizenship, really. And we'll talk more about that. But um, both through my Unitarian Universalist roots, my mother's academic career at the University of Chicago, known for its theoretical rigor, and her exploration of different theologies, the history of theologies, her focus on Mesoamerica and the history of the Aztec people, chance to travel with her when I was a sophomore year. I think all of these were big contributing factors towards the path I ultimately took. Um, so I went to DePaul University as an undergraduate. My first intent was to be a diplomat or go into international affairs. So I majored in international studies, and as I kind of pursued this, I became increasingly interested in the academic path. But to be honest with you, by the time I graduated in international studies, I had a minor in political science and another in Spanish. I was unsure of my direction, but so I ended up going abroad, and I enrolled in a program called Visions in Action. I don't know if they're still around. I would need to look into that. But what it does is it's a 6 to 12 month program in different locations around the world in which you're put into local NGOs. So it's purely voluntary, but you're living in a group with others who are also serving in this way. So it's a little bit like a nonprofit Peace Corps for a shorter amount of time. And so, without knowing exactly what I was going to do with my life and my career, I headed off to South Africa in 1994. This was after graduating, I'm sorry, 1997, after graduating from DePaul. And I landed in Johannesburg, South Africa. And this was 1997. So this was, I don't know, the second or third year of Nelson Mandela's presidency. Amazing time to be in South Africa, but also really, really difficult time, because it was the end of apartheid, but you can change the law, but it's so much harder to change society norms and culture. And so there were two things happening. Many white South Africans were fleeing the country, giving it up, going to United States, Australia, British Commonwealth. Um, and at the same time, there was some economic turbulence, but also crime was becoming increasingly a problem. And then actually another serious problem was the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which was just afflicting so many people across South Africa. And but it was at the early stages without much of a solution. So I spent 6 months there, traveled a bit around Southern Africa, and at that point I decided I wanted to go back and be go into academia, be a professor. I was just fascinated with that, I think, after the travels. And so I applied to political science programs. I wasn't accepted into the programs I applied to, except for one, which was at the University of Chicago, in the master's in the program of social sciences. It wasn't specifically political science. So I went back to Chicago. I tended a bar. I worked in a restaurant. I served tables. And I took classes at University of Chicago, some in political science, some in sociology, but also some in history. And when I finished that program, I also became very interested in Brazilian culture, Brazilian music, and I applied to different programs. I don't think I applied very well, but to different PhD programs. But this is how luck plays in graduate school applications. I applied to Stanford University, and I said I was interested in studying Brazil, history of Brazil. The problem was, at that time, Stanford didn't have a professor who taught history of Brazil. So I would not have gotten it accepted, except that after I had submitted my application, they hired a historian in Brazil. And so when they were going through the applications, they said, "Oh, we need someone to work with this new professor. Here's someone who's has decent grades and is qualified enough, but fits that profile." So I think that was the main reason I was accepted into Stanford. It wasn't because of some brilliant, shining application, but because there was a need and a fit that I didn't know of, and that other applicants didn't know either. Right? How could they know that they were going to hire? So that started this California academic career, in which I focused on Brazil, slavery, history of slavery, race, and that got me to travel to Brazil. Um, and then after that, long story short, applied for academic jobs. I worked up at University of Puget Sound, did a year at University of California, Berkeley, finally landed a tenure track job at this beautiful university where I'm at now, Soka University of America. Um, and uh, and not realizing how good of a fit it would be at the time. And then over the years of being teaching here, which is now stretching into 16 years, seeing how much of a fit it was. Let me end with that by saying that um, Stan- places like Stanford try to train professors for research institutions. They don't train professors for liberal arts colleges, right? They train for professional academics who are going to publish and teach at R1 universities. Um, so I wasn't. I think I was fortunate because I had the international studies background at DePaul. I had this childhood of broad exposure and parents who taught me to teach to think very open-mindedly, and I think those were as helpful as my PhD in being able to teach here and enjoy it and have such meaningful interactions with students, brilliant students such as yourself, Scott, over the years. So it's funny how life is just a mix of just uh, you know, for lucky fortunes and then making the best of those and not giving yourself too much credit, right? For but enjoying it as it goes. So that's a kind of the story of how I got here. Of course, I could say a lot more about my more recent years, but I trace it back to my parents, my religion, Chicago, DePaul, travel, South Africa and Brazil to why I'm here.
Oh, thank you so much, Ian. And I feel like that was such a thoughtful uh, summary, right, of so much of what you've experienced from the very beginnings up until now. There's definitely some like really important pieces that you've identified that made it so that like now looking back, you can truly say that nothing was wasted in your experiences, and how even like the trajectory, right, maybe career wise of your parents really informed who you are now, what you're interested in, what gets you really excited and passionate about. And actually, that's something that I think a lot about, right? Kind of where does passion come from, right? Is it just is it something that you observe from like your parents? Is it something that kind of you pick up on the street from one experience, like, abroad, or from something kind of by chance? And I know that, to become passionate in something, it does entail a certain kind of like commitment that you take on that forms aspects of your identity. And so, I definitely want to like, hear more about like, okay, this passion for um, like research was something that was kind of cultivated from parents, right, who are highly educated, like you said. But then also like how that then gets like narrowed down to a particular region, or maybe now like particular technologies. I'm just curious, like when because you've mentored so many different like young people, including myself when I was an undergrad. Um, but like, how is it that you like support them in understanding like what does it mean to like cultivate a passion, right, for anything really? Like I'm just curious, like as like a kind of big question to start off with, like how would you respond to that?
Such a great question, and I'm humbled to even try to answer it. I because, and I say that honestly because in the last couple years, without going into too much detail, my life has taken some enormous changes and twists and turns, very unexpected and not always very easy. And so coming back here, I've been on leave for a while, for almost 2 years, and coming back is allows for that kind of reexamination of what should what is driving me or what should be driving me, right? And how can I get out? How can I inspire passionate pursuit among others and students? I mean, that's what we're called to do here. It is at the heart of the mission to cultivate a steady stream of global citizens dedicated to contributive life, and um, I hold that mission very seriously. Um, so, inspiring global citizens and inspiring them to be contributive requires that cultivation of passion. And so, what is that? What is it that drives us? And for me, lately, just talking about what is getting me out of bed and giving me something to say, like, okay, at this point in my day, I'm going to really get to do this thing that I really want to do. Um, it it's kind of I'm weighing the kind of new and the old. The old the older drives were related often to the kind of projects I was doing in historical research, um, focused on Brazil. I've written articles and a book on history of Brazil, and that turned more towards health, and that was history of epidemics and pandemics and infectious diseases, and so these were great fascination, and they still are. But I had to kind of put those aside for for a while as I was um, going through the twists and turns of life in the last year or two. And as I was doing that, somewhat out of necessity also, but also out of keen interest, I turned a little bit towards ed tech. And part of it was just in the fascination. And I say fascination as, we can be fascinated at something that has just marvelous potential for the future, or we could be fascinated with the mushroom cloud of a nuclear explosion, right? I don't mean fascination to be like, oh, this is just wonderful, but this is fascinating because that's changing, and that is, I think, the kind of technology that is coming into our humans' hands these days. So I'm grappling with this, Scott. Like, I want to bring back my earlier interests and keep them going. I had some projects going that I think would be really great to finish and get out there, but I'm also have these sort of new pursuits and and trying to sort of navigate between those. Sometimes I feel that you know, I think we, we can make ourselves feel bad if we wake up one day or we go through a whole day and we look back at that day and say, there was not a moment during my day in which I was just thrilled to be doing what I was doing. Right. Or we might look back over a week and say, there wasn't a day this last week in which I was doing something that I was thrilled to be doing. Right. And I think we can mistake passion for thrill. And I think we put too much pressure on ourselves that we're not happy or doing the right thing unless every day we're waking up to do something that thrills us, or at least there's one day during the week that we're doing something that thrills us. No, I think we need to think about a pursuit of our passion projects as something over the longer run, and that will have a range of emotions. And sometimes those emotions could be boredom, dread, just complete dislike. Um, but then, uh, but as long as we know, or they have a capacity to turn to something that we do get value from, or we do get joy from, then I think that's where we can see it being meaningful. In other students, and in others, I think that it's a matter of cultivating two things, or three things really: empathy, um, uh, um, creativity, and curiosity. I think those are the three. Um, we need to be. The world is just unbelievably amazing if we start to dig into it in any aspect of it, right? And that, if we have this drive of curiosity, then we start to see, we can kind of pull aside the veil and see that things are not as we generally understand them to be. The closer we look at things, the more we see that they aren't what we first thought them to be. We also start to realize that um, we can answer a lot of questions, but as we answer questions, they inevitably lead us to new questions. And the more we go that path, the deeper we get into things, and that is what I think defines expertise, the more we realize how little we know. And that is so the pursuit of curiosity. Um, but this I think this has to be done in a way that thinks about our place in this world, not only with other humans, but all the living things and non-living things around us. And so this is the kind of empathy that should also be guiding our curiosity. Um, it should be for the betterment of ourselves, our community, our family, our society, and but not so much bettering our humanity as that it is leading to mass extinction or an unlivable planet, right? So we somehow have to see ourselves within a world of living, non-living things in which we are not the the tip of the pyramid. We are part of it and dependent on it, and need to be humble and empathetic in front of it. And then finally, the creativity, that is our capacity to use our curiosity and empathy to create something um, new. This is, I think, what is beautiful about life, in that it has the capacity to reinvent itself in small and big ways. And I think this is at the heart of creativity. And I owe a great deal to my parents and especially my mother. This was something that she really emphasized when I was a kid. She emphasized creativity as much as knowledge, right? And I think if we emphasize both of those, then then we can use that knowledge for good. Um, so yeah, so that's in a broad sense. How do you do this in a day to day or in a classroom? That's a different question. But um, I hope, just in summary, that after short or long interactions with students, that they come away more curious, more empathetic, and better able to create. And so I hope that is what is in service of the mission statement there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was a former student, so I can say with confidence that in our many conversations and interactions, the experiences that we had, I would say you wanted, students like myself to hold space for that like deeper reflection that invites, those questions, that tie into like the curiosity piece of it, but also like having that space to kind of build something that wasn't there before, and just kind of like guide us towards like new uncharted territory. And I feel like that's why a liberal arts education is so important because taking stock of the terrain and our surroundings right now in current times, um, it really only kind of leads us to one conclusion, right? We're kind of like doomed. I think it's all negative, but I think when you're able to look beyond that, and have that hope that there has to be something else, and it will take work, but like we need to find that. That's where we can really start to see change, and for more people to have that kind of passion to really like drive forward and seek that out, not only for themselves but for everyone around them. I think that's really going to be important, to kind of tip the balance towards one that we can really see more change in the world. So, when you talked about like passion, I just, because like you have to be passionate to carry out and complete something like a PhD. You have to be passionate if you're going to be in front of a bunch of students and really feel like you're making a difference, because it's so easy, right? Students can like tune out other people. But I appreciate how, that passion is not from like a thrill seeking stance, because I think that's what a lot of people view it as, right? Someone who's like kind of wildly gesticulating and speaking loudly, and it's just, it's contagious, right? That energy. But, that energy can be kind of channeled all over the place, right? I think having this mindful kind of like intentional, direction or redirecting that energy towards a specific goal is really what you're speaking about. And you know, the one thing that I wanted to ask you now as a follow up is that um, I think as a result of like these major changes in technology, like I'm thinking more specifically in terms of how we are all connected, you know, on like social medias, and just the pervasiveness of that, how effective that technology is now with the introduction of AI. Everything has just become that much more instantaneous, and so the curiosity piece I feel like requires a certain um, well, I mean, it's not meant to be like immediate in the same sense. It's exploratory, right? It's maybe a little bit more adrift, but we are not really, you know, setting students up in the same way that we used to, of like kind of allowing them, you know, taking their own paths. Maybe it's not the most direct path, but now with AI, there's this kind of mentality that has like shifted where it's not about asking the many different questions and enjoying the pursuit of that, like where will this lead me? It's like, no, I need to know now. Just tell me. And like, and then the question is, well, who's actually telling you, right? This ambiguous thing called the algorithm, right? And so like, what are your thoughts about how we're able to continue to like cultivate that passion within young people amidst a kind of, you know, system and structure of like, you know, like this media landscape that I would argue is kind of going the opposite direction. It's, you know, kind of sucking away that passion in exchange for profits or their attention.
Yeah.
And how is that setting us up for this kind of new and better future? It just seems very kind of counter, you know, to what we're really trying to do in terms of cultivating global citizens. So that, yeah, what are some concerns that you have with regard with that? What are some of your hopes, and how is
Sure.
this like your most recent passion with like AI kind of helped you address some of those concerns, assuage some of those concerns? I don't know.
Yeah, those are great questions, and I agree with you entirely when it comes to passion. I mean, I think passion. I don't know the etymology, but it has something to do, I think, in Latin with heat, right? When we talk about something is passion, we're talking. I think it has something to do with heat, and so I think it's like it is. Well, I think we can think of it as like a fire, but sometimes the fire burns hot, and sometimes it's just a kind of a glowing ember, and we have to feed it, right? And we have to maintain it, and we have to clean. I mean, it takes work. You know, fire that it's not there just on its own. So I like that very much. And Wow, yeah, technology. I mean, I think that this is also really important for your podcast because there are some really interesting. Um, I think we can look at some we can look at some very interesting relationships between AI and global citizenship, and I've been thinking quite a bit about this lately. And I think we can look at it very we can have an optimistic view. We have to have that hope, right? Scott. So I hope by the end of this, I can add to that hope, and get us to a position where we can maybe, with that hope, create good action. But there's also good reasons to be frightened of this too. Now, I don't think you know, the thing about hope is I don't think we need to have it absolutely. Like without it, what's the point of anything? What's the point of doing anything good? Right? If you don't expect there to be a positive outcome, how can we be ethical? How can we be moral without hope? We have to have it. But we can't have hope can't shine so bright that it blinds us, right? So it can coexist with fear. It can coexist with this, it can coexist even with anger. As long as we kind of channel that in a positive way. No. So this is a big question when it comes to artificial intelligence, because I tend to think that and I think you touched on it, Scott, a bit with when talking about algorithms, because we tend to think of art as AI as this kind of brand new sort of technology that's just emerging. That suddenly it's coming in, that we have these chatbots, right? But AI is a part of a much older story that has been going on for a long time, right? I think you could stretch the history of AI back to the printing press, really, right? The kind of this dissemination of information, the collection of that, the use of that information in different mediums and forms, and I think we can see this progression in which humanity has been able to take what used to be knowledge transmitted orally and to collect it in a more static form through writing, uh, through other technologies like video, recording, this podcast. And then in the last 10, 20 years, starting to use computer technologies to organize and disseminate and to actually change the shape of that information uh, based on hopefully our preferences, but sometimes based on the program preferences of others. And in some ways, that has led to so much good in this world, in that it can help us solve problems through incredible forms of data analysis, like genome sequencing is a great example of this. Finding out the mysteries of human life would not be possible without algorithms. But I think we tend to see how it's also really harming us, right? Or could potentially harm us. And that is through its modes of generally um, what used to be entertainment, but is now increasingly used for propaganda, for advancing interests of of a few people, I think, who see the world in a certain way, and use it for profit seeking and profit and gain. And then we also see it being used by governments for their own interests, and sometimes those interests are totalitarian. So yes, I think we're at the eve of a great technological revolution, and I mean great not as good, but as big. So we can compare this to the emergence of electricity, and how it became ubiquitous, right? And how it drove so many of the things that we use on a day to day to that make our life more comfortable and easier, but also create a world that is headed towards unlivability, right? And I mean, without electricity, and uh, we would be in a very different world. Or it's like nuclear, right? Here is a nuclear power. A nuclear power can create an amazing clean energy. In fact, it might be one part of the solution out of the climate crisis we're in, if used in a certain way. Um, but we also have nuclear weapons, which can destroy humanity. So I think AI is turning into one of these where it has the potential to solve our greatest problems, or contribute, or become even an existential threat to us. So it's how we use it. It's how we control, how we regulate it, which is really going to matter for us. And that's, I think, where we need to be hopeful that we can control it, we can corral it to be useful, to allow us to become uh, um, to create a more peaceful world, a more just world, a more environmental sustainable world in which we are um, living side by side in empathy and respect as global citizens.
No, thank you for sharing that and giving us this like bigger perspective on what AI is, the the history of just technology and its use and function for humans in our society. But one of the things, because you're kind of putting AI on like the same level as like electricity in terms of its great influence, right? The revolution, right? How that will change our lives, and as well as like nuclear energy. And there's like these interesting kind of like dichotomies of like it's either really good or it's really bad, right? Right? Like good versus evil kind of thing. But it still is kind of framed as like a tool, right? It can be
Yeah.
used in one way, it could be used in another way. And I recently had this conversation with some friends from the Cata Center. Shout out to all of them over there, and they really focus on nuclear disarmament, nuclear abolition. And one of the things that they cite often is that it's not so much the technology itself that's bad, right? Again, going to your point, it's the will, right, to use it. And so it speaks to the deeper part, right, of like human psychology and just human nature, right, whatever you want to call it, that feels like it is okay to use it in one way or the other. There's a deeper root to that. And so I think where my biggest, concerns come from, stem from like, yeah, who is who is the one making that decision? How is it that like we are hopefully transforming and reforming the that deeper rooted feeling of like why they would want to use AI, to either solve all the issues or to um, create a very radically different world that only suits their interests, or just shuts everything down because of just how overloaded everything already is. I don't know. Do you have any thought about that, and how that even ties into your work of like, really at a grassroots level interacting with young people and just talking with them? And
Absolutely.
is there like a faith component as well? Because I know from when I think about it, there's definitely that.
Yeah.
But for you, what you were sharing from the very beginning about being a Unitarian Universalist, how does that factor in as well?
It does, and I think it does. That's such an interesting question, and one that I haven't pondered enough, and I need to think more about how this might fit with my own kind of faith. Um, but going back to your point on the Cata Center and nuclear nonproliferation, that this is comes down to, we need to not think so much about we can't think about technology as separate from people and values we have, right? We can say, oh, this technology is just, it's as if it's evolving by itself, right? It's not. It's evolving in constant kind of embodiment with humans. And so values matter. And I think this is really where I kind of grapple with ideas of global citizenship, because as as both helping us understand the problem and then also hopefully leading us more to a kind of solution. So, I let me take a step back. So I think in order to answer your question, let me just take a step back on how I kind of conceive of global citizenship. And I know that there's different conceptions and of it, but to me, it's this uh, it's a capacity to learn and grow from difference in this world in a way that leads us to a more collective organization of humanity that's dedicated to peace, it's dedicated to a better world, a sustainable world, yet not giving up on the incredible diversity that exists in this world. It's not a flattening of the world, right? It's not an imposition of Western values on others. It's not an imposition of any one particular point of view on others. We cannot do that. That was the colonial sentiment, right? I think that global citizenship is anti-colonial in that it has this really deep and, again, I'm going to use the word radical empathy of trying to understand and respect differences. And that includes value differences. And that includes opinions we don't like. And that includes cultural practices we don't like. Now, I also don't think we should be in a world in which it's all relativist, in which everybody just does what they want, because you might have some groups of people who decide that, for example, girls shouldn't be educated, only boys, right? I think that there needs to be a set of kind of foundational values, as few as possible, but those that respect human life, that give people basic necessities, that allow everyone opportunity to education. I think there are just some basic human rights that are should be global and universal. And we have a great starting point with the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The thing is, that was written 70 years ago, and now we live in a different world, and we have different risks, and we have different concerns. But we're not in a position to kind of update that document. And today, there would be no chance for, I think, the whole world to sign a revised Declaration of Human Rights, unfortunately. But that is the kind of so that is the kind of picture I'm kind of getting to. So let's bring in some of these technologies like AI. So if we are able to understand that we live in an incredibly value diverse world and that we have to respect this value diversity, we can't be creating a technology that assumes one set of values. And that's the direction that AI has been trying to go, driven by these big companies that see global domination through kind of a lens of profit and capitalism, right? So we have these companies coming along and saying, we can have um, general intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and it's going to be great. But it has to rest on values. What are those values? Well, right now they're being decided in Silicon Valley. They're being decided in boardrooms. And they're not necessarily being decided at the community local level. And this is where I see artificial intelligence as in some ways antithetical to global citizenship, because it's not allowing for this kind of exchange and dialogue. Now you can prompt and you can push AI to do a little bit of that, but I don't see it set up in this way, right? So the path that it's going, I think, is one away from this radical kind of empathy we need to have with each other, this radical understanding, this growth we get from learning from others, um, while holding on to a basic set of human rights that we need to have to live in this world. It's not the direction it's going. But here's the small light of hope. I think it can. I think it can. I think we need to adjust how we see this technology and how we use this technology, is not creating some sort of almost divine intelligence that's going to guide humanity, but as something that can strengthen our diversity of values. So at the local level, it can reinforce the goals of a community, the values of that community. It can strengthen and preserve some of the cultures and traditions of that community, while at the same time, I think allowing for a education of and protection of more universal human rights. Um, the technology doesn't exist to do that, but I don't see why we can't get to a world that kind of allows a little bit more of that. So that's at the broadest sort of level. Now I can talk. I'll pause there and see if you want to pursue anything there. But I mean, there's a different question of how you do that, for example, in the classroom. And I can talk a little bit about that if you want to, or another direction.
No, no. I mean, I think what you've kind of like put onto the board is already like very thought provoking. And I really appreciate how you prefaced all of that with your own articulation and understanding of what global citizenship means to you. Because, yeah, it's very important within that context that, people understand that because of this, emphasis on learning and growing from this difference, that, we need to like anchor ourselves in certain values so that it's not just like at the whim of any one individual or corporation or government or whatever that entity might be, and that we're engaged in this as you said, like deep radical empathy, because we can't afford at this moment in time to just turn our brains off, even though that's probably what most of these companies want us to do, because they make money from that. And we all fall victim to it. I mean, they've gotten so good. The marketing, propaganda, everything, it's dialed in, but that also speaks to the silos that we live in, because our phones are those portals that take us to those like kind of echo chambers. It doesn't have to be that way, and I know that there have been, there are definitely apps that seek to provide us with that greater perspective. But I just feel like, just engaging in that kind of dialogue, knowing that the concern is there, and kind of banding together with individuals who truly want to like surface more questions about yeah, where are these values being anchored in, and how are we also watering right, those values, because it's not enough just to kind of let them lie dormant, but we're trying to grow something, right? That's, I think life is meant to grow. It's either going to grow or it's going to die. And so we're kind of seeing a certain form of I don't know if it's societal decay, but there's definitely some kind of malaise that has, been taking, place in the world that is undeniable, and yet we're still kind of stuck. But I really appreciate the silver lining that you provide us with, because it's not like we're blinded by the hope, but that the pierce, like the strength of like even one ray of hope is what's gonna like allow us to kind of continue that work, and just understand kind of, yeah, the current times demand a greater effort and certain like direction, that otherwise, like it's I don't want to envision like what the next 20 years would be like if we just threw our hands up. So this is a huge question, and one that probably we can go on for like at least
Yeah,
another hour, if not
yeah,
an entire week in a conference format. I would like to ask those additional questions, but unfortunately, we are kind of coming up to the end of our conversation.
yeah,
But I wanted to ask one final question, if that's okay.
yeah, sure.
And it's about any recommendations that might help, further stimulate our listeners in regards to either the conversation about global citizenship. It could be about AI and kind of where we're at, or it could be just something completely different that you find yourself going back to. I'd be very curious to hear what your recommendations are.
Yeah, sure, Scott. And I promised earlier in the conversation that I wouldn't just lead us to doom and gloom. Um, Look, I am hopeful because when we think about AI, it 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 could allow for something very, very important and powerful. Okay, so let me just really quickly. I know we're running short on time, but going back to this idea of global citizenship as this radical empathy and learning from difference, I would say that if most of humanity just became much more curious and respectful and open to cultural difference, this world would be so much more peaceful, that there would be so much less violence, right? If removing those biases and prejudices and xenophobia and racism. I mean, if just this respect is, nonetheless, there are irreconcilable differences of views, and there are irreconcilable values. I gave you the example of a society, for example, that does not believe in providing education for its girls, right? I don't think anybody listening would would agree with that, right? And so what do we do with that? Like, when we're confronted with those kinds of situations, right? The the way to do with it is not necessarily by force, but by dialogue, by respectful dialogue, by trying to convince the other group that girls have just as much should have just as much opportunity to education as boys, and that it takes patience and persistence and trying to convince, and hopefully prevailing eventually of this as of a basic human right, that everybody, all kids, should have opportunity to education. Now, this is where I think AI can help, right, in providing that kind of context, that information, that dialogue, the framework. I can see it as a tool for an example like this, right? In which we're engaged in a conversation with another group that shares a different value, and we're trying to get to some sort of compromise, some middle ground that makes for a better. I think the technology can. can do that. I really do. I don't think it's just gonna only lead us down a dark path, but it's just not set up that. But here's the hopeful thing: is that you can prompt and you can structure your own use of AI in a very positive way. um, Tell it, don't let it control you. You are the one in charge. Uh, I like to argue with my AI. I like to assume that it's not correct, and I don't like it when it's just being telling me that I'm great and smart and brilliant, because I think it's brown note. I just push it. So anyway, that aside, there are some great books and articles out there. There's one by Ethan Mollick called Co-Intelligence. It's a little too techno-optimistic, but I think Mollick gets to the power and potential of AI, including in the classroom, as creating very individualized, very tailored tutoring or teaching that can get right to the ways that individuals learn, because everybody learns in a different way. So if we can have a tool that helps us learn in the way we learn, then that's an amazing revolution in education, right? Moloch, I think, gets at that optimism, but he doesn't get enough at the risks, right? Um, Another one that you might get at is an interesting book is The Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford. It's it's a little bit, it's not as happy, environmental, political, and social costs of AI. These two books, Co-Intelligence, Atlas AI, might be a nice debate if you're to read both of us. And then finally, UNESCO just came out with a really interesting document. Well, not it's updated the document, I think, recently, which is guidance on generative AI education research. And you might check that out, because I think that's the best kind of place where AI and global citizenship and education are kind of coming together in a kind of a discussion and a kind of policy framework and recommendations. So any teachers out there, anyone educating, or just anyone who's concerned with how to use AI well themselves, might just go to that UNESCO document, Guidance for Generative AI, and use it in their own practice, their own teaching, or for their own use. But yeah, Scott, there's so much more we can say. And again, I'm just so honored. I don't know how many years we've known each other. More than a decade, I think 12 years. I'm not sure,
I think it's
but
been like since 2012. So
2012. Okay, so
yeah,
13 years.
yeah.
And that was when you were taking my class, I was still figuring out how to be a teacher. And so I want us to recognize that this was a moment when we both met, that we were both creating and learning our own journeys, I think, from each other. And then you've had just an amazing career, and I've been just so astonished here. Here was this first year student in my class, just beginning to learn about Brazil, and here you are today with with better Portuguese abilities than me, and spending more time in Brazil than I have, and and going on to this illustrious career in education. And so uh, I'm very uh, happy and proud to have been a small part in that. I think there's so many people involved in your path, in our paths, but for to be one of them is an honor. So this has just been so much fun, Scott. I really enjoyed it. Um, I just thanks for letting me come on today.